First of all, I want to thank Paul Dotterer for assuming some of our musical duties after Whitney's departure. I love listening to Paul play. I also enjoy chatting with Paul, in whose inquisitiveness and earnestness I find inspiration and challenge and like-mindedness.
Not too much challenge.
Not so. One of the things that Paul and I have discussed from time to time is the question of whether or not ends justify the means. And we have come to a few different conclusions on the matter, if it can be said that a conclusion ends in a question mark. One of the conclusions that we've come to is that, in fact, there's no such thing as an end. That every end is actually a means to another end, which is in turn a means to another end, which is, of course, a means to a means. So there's cause and effect, but if everything is interconnected, then no effect can even be temporarily final. What this does, of course, is put the burden of the question squarely in the arena of means. I hope this does not appear to be navel-gazing. The case of ends v. means is pertinent to almost every decision you think you make. So do the ends justify the means? Well, not, I would say, if there are no ends and only means. Means must then be said to be just and justifiable in and of themselves. And the question, more pointedly put, becomes, do unjust means justify means of broader scope and greater good? Are you with me so far? Hang on. Do unjust means, which lead to broader and possibly better things, are they justifiable? And this answer is pretty hard to find. And it may be impossible to find. And it's likely irrelevant. So, Tom, you don't have to worry about it. Do unjust means justify means of broader scope and greater good? I mean, where does that end? At what point does the measurement become conclusive? It doesn't. Ever. Indeed, once you start playing this game, you are drawn ever onward and possibly upward in scale as well, until the breadth and depth and complexity of all the factors become incomprehensible, and the whole enterprise moots itself. So let's come back to a more manageable scale. The question of ends and means pivots around justification. It's a question about justice. And my point is that justice is not a result. I'll say that again because I think it changes the game a little bit. Justice is not a result. There are no ends. There are no results. And yet this is how we often, and I believe mistakenly, think about justice. Justice is not a result. Justice is not a means to a means. It is perpetual input. It is a way of being. Justice is a mode. Therefore, justice, like love, must be its own reward. You don't do it for toys and cookies. Or rather, I should say that justice, like loving, must be its own reward. And if that's not the case, if your act of justice, if your mode of justice is not in and of itself enough, then you may not actually be doing justice. You may in fact be operating out of ego need. I have many times seen people involve themselves in social justice concerns as a means of giving themselves an identity. I've done that myself. So I can say with some experience that such a posture towards justice making can be quite superficial. Charity can be an act of self-centeredness. I imagine that these souls are troubled by their own sense of vulnerability. They have not made peace with their imperfections and so seek to ameliorate them by donning a ready-made identity. Now, on the one hand, there are far worse avenues for addressing a distressed ego. Still, it is not healthy to the practitioner, the practice, or the cause. These people wear justice like a brand name. It's bling. Like some people wear Rolex, others wear social justice. But what if they're doing good work? Well, this is our original question, given example. The question is, do the ends justify the means? And look, good work done out of a deceived self-centeredness is not all for naught. For one thing, mimicry may well lead to actuality. This is what we call fake it till you make it. And there are worse ways. But I also want to make a distinction at this point between self-centeredness and enlightened self-interest, which is, from my point of view, essentially the same thing as self-awareness. Self-interest and self-centeredness are both generated by the vulnerability of the self. Self-interest engages one's vulnerability, works on one's vulnerability, and so puts vulnerability at its center in a way that vulnerability contributes to wisdom and strength. And in this way, through vulnerability, self-awareness opens us to the experience of others. It aspires to what Martin Buber described as I-thou relationships. With a healthy relationship to its core of vulnerability, self-awareness engenders empathy and compassion and a fundamental kind of strength. On the other hand, self-centeredness is the inability to engage vulnerability in a healthy way. It is blind to itself and denies its fears. It is comfortable in what Martin Buber describes as I-it relationships. Denying its own vulnerability, self-centeredness denies the vulnerability, which is to say, the personhood of others. And as we've noted, sometimes this can be done by co-opting the vulnerability of others. But because this vulnerability has no real home within the self, it is superficial, potentially abusive, and denies real vulnerability, even as it revels in the emotional wash of perceived and perhaps even yearned for vulnerability in others. There is an extreme version of self-centeredness that leads one entirely out of any concern for justice. And in our American context, which champions the material and the individual, this is a pernicious sin for which we must be ever watchful. This is the sin of apathy, where comfort is thought to be the proof of invulnerability. This evil ends, as all evil does, with irony. For apathy is the ultimate seduction into the very thing that the self-centered ego fears, namely the elimination of the self. Comfort in one's circumstance, like any indulgence, is not in and of itself an evil, but it is, like any indulgence, easily abused by overuse. Unchecked, it leads to apathy, and apathy is psychological suicide. Self-interest, on the other hand, generates principles to address vulnerabilities. Self-centeredness corrupts those principles. Self-awareness generates a strong character. Apathy erases character, erases what it seeks to protect. Self-centeredness erases the self. And I feel like I can speak with some authority on all this because I don't know about you, but I've had some experience with self-awareness, self-centeredness, and apathy, sometimes all in the same epoch of my life. And I know where they have each led me. And I know which of these promotes deep satisfaction, peace, and resolve. And here we get to the seed bed of justice. Why is justice so important? This you may answer confidently. Without justice, there is no chance for deep satisfaction, no chance for peace, and no chance for resolve. See, justice is personal. It is a highly personal act. You may want to consider justice as intimate work. For like love, it is both outward and inward focused. It is as concerned with the other as it is with the self because it erases the boundary between the two. It realizes as long as someone is not free, no one is free. If it can happen to you, it can happen to me. And this means that the stakes are high. With justice work, it's always a double down type bet. That is, the stakes are raised times 2. For not only are you working on the world, you are working on yourself. So here's the nugget. You can and should be outraged by the slippery slope of fascism. You can and should be outraged by the culture and methods our county and state employees use to address undocumented people. You can and should be outraged by Goliath chemical companies and factory farms that monopolize and poison the food supply. You can and should be outraged that our political discourse has been co-opted and polarized in order to divide and conquer our country. You can and should be outraged. But justice is not the result of outrage. Justice is not a result. There are no results. Justice is a means. Justice is a life. Justice exacts attention. It demands that we know as much as we can about the systems in which we participate. False justice, justice which comes from self-centeredness, will change very little in the long run. Only justice that comes from self-awareness and a healthy relationship with one's own vulnerability can generate a progressive, positive evolution of means. Ultimately, justice is about integrity. And therefore, justice asks everything of us. And you can run yourself ragged in its pursuit, because ultimately integrity is impossible. Certainly impossible on the scale of modern civilization, maybe impossible on the human scale, period. So, we are caught. We are in an impossible situation, incapable of accomplishing the task that we set before ourselves. It is maddening and frustrating and defeatist. And so it is that the very pursuit of justice throws our vulnerability in our face. But remember where the impulse comes from. We've come full circle. Because justice comes from self-awareness or enlightened self-interest, which places vulnerability, the very same vulnerability that the pursuit of justice has thrown in our face, we take that and put it in the center. We'll keep it there, and we will face it, invite it to tea. Engage your vulnerability, and through that, engage the world. Vulnerability is the cost and promise of consciousness. So, do not be dismayed. Vulnerability is where the light comes from. The light in your body. The light in the eyes of everyone you meet. You will rise in body or spirit. Join us in singing hymn number 121. We'll build a land. join me in extinguishing our chalice. We'll read the words in unison printed on the bottom of your order of service. These are the words of our mission. This church
provides a safe place to celebrate diversity, draw inspiration from our lives, foster social and environmental justice, and compassionately support each other in our spiritual pursuits.
So it's our mission to foster social and environmental justice. We have a great opportunity in 2 weeks, downtown Phoenix, when thousands of our brothers and sisters will gather. And I can tell you that one of the missions of that gathering will be to get in touch with our own vulnerability. And what that looks like is listening and witnessing and showing up. And if you cannot attend, those who do will tell you all about it. And we will go from there. Amen.
Good, how are you? Thank you for my hours.
I forgot your name. What's your
Now I understand.
Now